Chapter 1. Rusty opened her eyes and blinked a few times. Where was she? She sat up, letting the sheet covering her fall to her waist, only then realizing she was completely naked. She never slept naked. Her head was pounding. What had she done? Good morning, beautiful. At the words, Rusty jerked the sheet back up over her breasts, flashes of the night before coming back to her. Cody Walters. She should not be in Cody's bed. She should be in her own bed. Before the previous evening, she'd been a virgin. A virgin in love with one of her closest friends. But that didn't matter at the moment. What mattered was that she was naked in Cody's bed. Would you take me home? She asked with as much dignity as she could muster. What did you say to someone you just slept with? She had no idea. She'd never intended to do anything like that. I'd like to talk a little first if you don't mind. Is your head all right? You got pretty darn sloshed last night. Cody sat up in bed as well, and the sheet fell to his waist. He had, well, the words gorgeous shoulders came to mind. Could shoulders really be gorgeous? I do mind. Would you please leave and let me put some clothes on? Close your eyes or something? She genuinely liked Cody. They'd been friends for years, but this was not how she'd planned to further their friendship. Not at all. Cody sighed. We're going to talk. All you're doing is delaying it for a little while. Rusty closed her eyes as he got out of bed, realizing he was just as naked as she was. Well, that made sense. He couldn't exactly have done that with her if he'd been fully clothed, now could he? Not that they should have been doing that together anyway. The short peek she got of him made her think about biting his shoulder. Now why on earth would she even think about biting him? She'd never done anything like that in her entire life. Or maybe she had. She had a memory of something like that, but everything was kind of running together at the moment. When she heard the door close behind him, she jumped out of bed and ran to his adjoining bathroom. She quickly dressed and used his facilities, going out into the living area. I'm ready to go. He glanced at her and shrugged. I'll take you home, but you can bet your sweet cheeks we're going to talk about this. Soon. Not if I have anything to say about it. She walked out to his truck and carefully climbed in the passenger side. For as outdoorsy as she was and as strong as she was much shorter than average. She had steps installed on her own truck to help her get in and out. Cody deliberately drove as slowly as he could toward her house on the Cauldrons Ranch. I didn't intend to take advantage of you when I took you home with me, he started. Unfortunately, I remember everything that happened. I know you didn't take advantage of me. Rusty stared out the window. Every time she looked at him, she pictured biting his shoulder for some absurd reason. And she couldn't get the image of his bare body out of her mind. He was truly a sexy man. But they'd been friends since junior high, and it didn't feel right that she was thinking about him naked. Not at all. I'm not sure why you won't talk to me then. Because I made a monumental mistake. I think sex belongs within marriage, and I was upset, and I drank too much, and I ended up in bed with a man I'd barely seen since high school. How am I supposed to feel? Rusty just wanted to go home and forget what had happened. Surely, he could understand that. He sighed. When he'd seen her at the bar, he'd been surprised, because she was almost never there, but when she started tossing back whiskey like there was no tomorrow, he'd ended his billiard game and walked over to sit on the bar stool next to hers. That's a lot of whiskey, he'd said. Yeah. Tastes awful, was her only response. You might want to slow down. I've never seen you drink. He was worried about the sheer volume of the alcohol. He wasn't much of a drinker himself, but he'd seen that much whiskey make men do things they regretted. I don't ever drink, she said, tossing back another shot of whiskey. I need another. I think I'm going to drive you home tonight, Cody said, planning to be the perfect gentleman. Whatever you want. I don't care about anything anymore. Cody had been concerned at those words and had decided then to take her back to his place. If she was feeling that badly, he didn't want her to be alone all night. Did something happen? He asked. Her voice was already more than a little slurred when she answered. Yes. I've been in love with the same man for a million years. She tossed back another shot, making a face. He took me to the wedding tonight, and I dressed like a girl and everything. She'd indicated her skirt that looked awfully good on her in his opinion. You look pretty whether you dress like a girl or not, he said softly. And you know what that fool did? As she became angrier, her voice was slightly less slurred. No, what did he do? He saw some hippy-dippy do at the reception and asked her to marry him. They'd never even met. So now, he's marrying her tomorrow, and he forgot all about me. It was our first date, and I just knew we'd end up married. Cody felt a pang, knowing how she'd felt about Aaron for years. Exactly the same way he felt about her. Oh, yeah, he knew who she was talking about. He'd watched her wander around in high school, mooning over the other man. I'm sorry he hurt you. She had yet another shot in her hand at that point. How many of these will it take for the pain to go away? She asked, tossing it back. I think you've reached your limit, Rusty, he said softly. He took the drink from her hand and pulled out his wallet to pay for her drinks. He didn't really have the money to pay the kind of liquor bill she'd racked up, but he'd worry about that later. For now, he needed to get her somewhere safe. He couldn't leave her alone with the state she was in, so he'd take her to his place and tuck her in one of the upstairs bedrooms. He'd always dreamed of having her in his bedroom as a teenager, and now he'd get his wish. He just wouldn't get to be in there with her. He half carried her out to his truck and made sure she got in, though he'd had to give her a boost to get her up. It had been comical, and he'd have laughed if he hadn't been so worried about her. She wasn't used to being drunk or wearing a skirt. The two combined was really funny. All the way to his place, she kept talking to him about how weird life was turning out. At least I have my horses. They love me, you know. I know they do. And you've always loved them. He remembered as a teenager, she'd always been horse crazy. She'd never really dated because she was holding out for Aaron, but she was also so busy with horses, he was sure she wouldn't have dated much anyway. He pulled into his driveway and reached over to unbuckle her seatbelt when she couldn't seem to remember how. Then he went around the truck and let her basically fall out onto him so he could help her into his house. He'd loved her for as long as he could remember, and he couldn't believe that when he finally got her to his place, she was drunk out of her mind. There was no way he could touch her, even if she wanted him to. He had standards. As soon as they were inside, he looked at his couch, deciding it would be easier to have her sleep there than to try to get her upstairs. When he went to get a sheet and blanket to make it up, she started stripping. He got back to the living room, and she had her shirt over her head. Am I ugly, Cody? You're the most beautiful girl in all of Cauldron Valley, he answered honestly. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. He'd always thought it was true, and though she wasn't a traditional beauty, she was perfect in his eyes. My boobs aren't too small, she asked, cupping them together in her hands and holding them up. I think they're too small. They're perfect. Everything about you is perfect. He took the sheet to the couch and started to make it up. When he turned around, she was gone, and he called out, Rusty, where are you? In here, she called. He found her in his bedroom, her bra on the floor. She smiled at him. Since you like the girls, I figure you should be the first guy to touch them. Cody closed his eyes to get the image of her naked breasts out of his mind. You don't want this. I promise. I'm making you a bed on the couch. When he opened his eyes, she'd walked closer to him. You don't want to touch them? He groaned. I do want to touch them, but I don't think you'd be happy with me in the morning if I did. It was taking every ounce of willpower he had to be a gentleman. Why hadn't he been raised to be a jerk? She reached out and started unbuttoning his shirt. When she was finished, she pulled it out of his waistband and pushed it off his shoulders. You have the most amazing shoulders in the whole wide world. Has anyone ever told you that? No, never. Well, you do. I'm a shoulders girl, you know. You can keep your butt where it is, but I like these shoulders. And she'd leaned forward and bitten one, surprising the crap out of him. I think you need to go and sleep on the couch, Rusty. But you haven't touched the girls yet. She pouted up at him like it was his job to touch her, and he wasn't fulfilling his duty. Rusty, if I touch the girls, it's going to lead to me making love with you, and I know that's not what you need right now, so I'm going to be a good boy and not touch you. She took a step closer to him, pressing herself against him, and he could feel her breasts against his bare skin. She'd reached up and pulled him down for a kiss, and though he'd wanted to resist her, he couldn't. He'd been in love with her for so long, and now she was in his arms, begging him to make love with her. How was a man supposed to resist a temptation like that? Now he felt remorse, of course, but it would have taken a monk to resist what she'd been offering the night before. He followed her directions and pulled up in front of her little rented house on Cauldron Land. Why don't I come in, and we'll talk? No thanks. Rusty got out of the truck and walked to the door. She stood with her back to him until she heard the truck drive off, and then she turned and watched him drive away. What on earth had she done? Had she ruined her life in just one night? And then Aaron drove past, and though she wanted to throw rocks at his truck, she managed to resist. She stood staring after him for a good long while, feeling like she was a zombie. How was she supposed to know what to say and do now? She'd saved herself for Aaron. Every move she'd made her entire life had been about him, and now, he was gone. Off to marry his little hippie girl, whom he didn't even know. Finally, she went inside and shut the door behind her, collapsing on the couch. She buried her face in her hands and cried, letting all of the emotion she'd kept pent up out. A few minutes later, she'd received a call from her friend, Rhodey. She didn't want to answer, but he was always trying to look out for her. If she didn't answer, he would just show up at her house, and she didn't want him or anyone else to know she'd been crying. It was hard to have female emotions and always be worried about how people would see you when you worked with men. Hello? Hey, you okay? Rhodey asked. Sure. I'm fine. Why? I'm not sure. Just heard you were outside looking confused, and I wanted to make sure you were doing okay. I'm fine, she repeated. I'm going to go to town, grab Subway for lunch, and bring it back. Why don't I bring you a foot-long turkey, like you always eat? Yeah, just remember, no pickles. Yeah. You hate pickle pea. The call ended, and Rusty looked down at herself, realizing she was still in the skirt and blouse she'd worn to the wedding. Well, rather she was in it again. She decided a nice long shower was exactly what she needed, and she got in, washing away all the memories of the night before. Of Cody kissing her and touching her. She shuddered. Why did those memories feel so good to her? She shouldn't have let a man she didn't love touch her that way, and more than that, she shouldn't have enjoyed it so much. She was dressed and waiting when Rhodey got back with her food. Thanks, she said, taking the sandwich from him, but leaving the door open so he could come in and eat with her. You disappeared during the reception last night. Where did you go? He asked. Rusty made a face. I was upset, so I went to the watering hole. His eyes widened. But you don't drink. I did last night, she said. I must have had half a bottle of whiskey before someone cut me off. Someone? He asked. An old friend. Rusty wasn't sure she'd ever be able to call him a friend again, though. She could still see his broad shoulders with no shirt on every time she closed her eyes. How could she be a friend with those memories rushing through her head? He eyed her curiously, but didn't push. "Anything you want to talk about?" he asked. They'd been friends since she'd started working at the ranch, and she had never had a problem confiding in him. She shook her head. She needed to talk about what had happened, but certainly not with Rhodey. Any man who worked with her was out. No, when it came to making monumental mistakes, she did them in private. Well, usually. After Rhodey left, she pulled out her phone and moved to the couch, calling her best friend from high school, another girl who had been horse crazy growing up. "Hello? Jana, it's Rusty. What's going on?" "Not much. It's just our busy season with all the kids' camps coming through here. I think I'm about to pull out the last 3 strands of hair that I have." Rusty laughed, which is what she'd needed. "Sounds like fun to me. You need a horse expert?" She looked around her house, which was neat as a pin as usual. She'd shove something in the crock pot for supper and go and help out with the kids. Always. "Maybe you could do one of your trick rides that the kids love to watch you do." Rusty got to her feet and grabbed the keys to her truck. "That sounds like just what the doctor ordered. Then she wouldn't have to spill her guts. Instead, she could hang out with horses all day and get her mind off Cody. And Aaron. But mainly Cody. Suddenly her feelings for Aaron seemed like they were unimportant. All her problems were now focused on Cody and the mess she'd made of her life the night before. She drove to the Calendar Ranch and saw that there were several stations set up around the ranch. She herself had gone to the Calendar Kids Ranch when she was a girl, and she truly believed in what they did there. She parked and got out, walking to the stables where Marcy was showing some of the kids how to saddle a horse. Marcy looked up and saw her coming, grinning at her. "Hey you. Jana said you were going to show the kids some trick riding today." The 5 kids that were with Marcy all turned and looked at her, and Rusty knew she had the floor. "I work at the Cauldron Ranch," she said, pausing as the kids all licked their fingers and raised them in the air. "I help train the horses there. My name is Rusty." "Wanna know why they call me Rusty?" The kids were young, no more than 6 or 7. "'Cause of your hair?" one of the girls asked. "Yes, very good. Now, I'm going to get to know this horse. He doesn't know me super well, so I'm going to talk to him before I ride." Rusty walked to the gelding in a stall, knowing he was a calm horse, or the Calendars wouldn't let the kids be around him. She walked to the horse's head and spoke softly to him, making sure to blow so he could smell her breath. "You and I are going to be good friends, and we're going to show these kids how a real cowgirl rides." When Rusty left the ranch an hour later, the kids were all in awe of her and her riding skills, and it felt good to not think about the night before. One stupid mistake didn't need to ruin her entire world, did it? Nah, she'd just avoid Cody like the plague, and all would be good. Maybe she'd even wear a mask around him, so she couldn't get his germs. She laughed at herself. She'd seen a few people wearing masks lately, like there was some kind of pandemic going on, but she herself would never wear one. Why bother? They looked silly, and she couldn't breathe with them on. Nah, she'd just avoid him, and all would be right with the world again. When she pulled into her driveway, she sat in her truck for a minute and made an avoiding Cody game plan. It would work. It had to. Chapter 2. Rusty was glad to work extra hours over the next few days and was even happier when Aaron wasn't at work. Her mind was such a jumble of confusion at that point that she didn't want to have to think about how she felt about him. On Tuesday evening, she was just taking her dinner, homemade lasagna, out of the oven when there was a knock at the door. She groaned, not wanting to have to deal with anyone at that time. She just wanted to eat and get ready for bed. She'd worked 12-hour days, both days that week, and she was going to have to do another on Wednesday. She was always the one who picked up the stray shifts others wanted to dump, because she loved working, and she didn't ever need too much time with her own thoughts. Especially now. She opened the door, not wanting to deal with anyone, and there stood Cody, leaning against the door jamb. "You ready to talk now?" Rusty sighed. "No, I'm ready to eat my supper and go to bed." She walked into the house, but left the door open so he could follow if he absolutely needed to. She heard the door shut behind her and said a silent prayer he'd left. "Whatever you're cooking smells wonderful." "Lasagna." "Oh, I love lasagna." "Did you get Stouffer's?" "That's my favorite." "No, I don't do frozen foods. I made it from scratch." She'd had it in her freezer for a couple of weeks, but she usually took one weekend a month and made up enough meals to eat on. She hated convenience foods and rarely ate out. Her own food was her favorite. Having been raised by her mother and her grandmother, she'd learned to cook at her grandmother's side. "You cook?" Cody's voice sounded incredulous, and Rusty couldn't help but smile. "I've been cooking since I was a little girl." "Why wouldn't I?" He shrugged. "I guess you just don't seem the type. I've had to make myself seem like I'm all masculine, because tiny women shouldn't work with big strong cowboys. When I first got here, all the guys were trying to help me do my job, and I had to show them I could do anything a man could. Well, except pee standing up, and that's not a skill I've ever desired." She couldn't quite figure out why men enjoyed it so much. Very strange in her mind. He choked back a laugh. "Is that so?" She nodded, getting down 2 plates and serving them each a portion of lasagna. "Since you're here, you might as well share my food with me." "What a lovely offer. I'd enjoy eating with you a great deal." She wrinkled her nose at him. "Sit down and eat." She avoided really looking at him as she slid the plate and a fork in front of him. Picturing him naked wasn't good for her. "Thanks," he said, sniffing the aroma. He took a big bite. "Oh, my goodness. This is better than Stouffer's." She rolled her eyes before sitting down at the table as well. "So nice to be better than frozen food. What a great compliment to my culinary prowess." He loved the way she got sarcastic. He loved everything about her, really. "Can we talk about the other night?" She shook her head. "Nope. I don't need indigestion. Just forget it ever happened." "I can't forget it happened, but I can give you a little more time to be ready to talk about it," he said. Cody couldn't believe he was the one wanting to chase after the relationship talk. In the movies, it was always the women who did that. Of course, it was because he'd loved her for so long. He just wished he could tell her that. After they'd finished eating, she quickly put the dishes in the dishwasher, and then hit a yawn. "I've worked 12-hour days the last 2 days, and I have another 12-hour day tomorrow. I'm heading to bed. Let yourself out." She walked toward her room, not waiting for a response. She knew she was being rude, but she didn't know what to say to him anymore. Cody was no longer a friend. Now he was just a big mistake she had never intended to make. Asterisk. Cody gave her a week before he showed back up at her door. "Do you want to talk?" "Nope. But thanks for asking." Rusty started to close the door in his face, but he caught it with his hand. "Was there something more?" "I really think we need to talk about what happened." She sighed. "Fine. Come in." She really didn't want anyone to overhear the conversation she was about to have with him. "Now let's talk." She walked to the couch and sat down. "Here's how I see it. I was upset. I got drunk. I never drink, so I got drunk a lot easier than most people would have. When I got drunk, you decided to take care of me, which was very kind of you. In my drunken state, I came onto you, and we had sex. Now I'm tired of talking about it. He frowned at her. You just want to forget it happened? Look, I made a huge mistake, but I don't see why it needs to change my entire life. I'm willing to move on and act like nothing ever happened. I would think you'd be happy enough to do that. Cody shook his head. And why would you think that? Isn't that what guys are always after? One night stands with no strings attached? Consider it done. I'm not. Cody looked at her, his eyes bleak. I want a real relationship with you. For a moment, but just a moment, she considered agreeing. How would that work? We've started in the middle, like we had a right to be making love already. We can't go back to the beginning and have a first date. She shook her head. No, I think it's best if we forget everything that happened and move on with our lives. She'd never be able to look at him without thinking about how stupid she'd been. Why would she want a constant reminder of that? No, we need to figure out a better solution than that. I feel like we're connected after that night, and I'm not ready to let you go. You really don't have a choice. Rusty got to her feet. Thanks for coming by. He frowned. I'm just going to come back. She sighed. I'm sure you will. She had no idea why he couldn't get it through his head that she was not interested in anything he had to say. She just wanted to forget, but how could she do that when he just kept turning up like a bad penny? Asterisk. A few weeks later, Rusty went for a Saturday morning ride. Now that she worked with horses, she very rarely took the time to ride for just pleasure. Horses, though she loved them with everything inside her, had somehow become part of the work category of her life. She went to the horse barn and found her favorite mount, a sweet gelding named Rebel. She talked to him for a moment before she saddled him and put his bridle on. As soon as she was atop his back, she dug her heels in, letting him run. It had been months since she'd taken the time to just fly atop a horse, and it felt right. Finally, something in her world felt right again. She rode across the ranch to the river where employees tended to swim during the summer months. Not intending to swim, and happy she was alone, she dismounted and squatted down watching the waves for a while. There was something about the tranquility of watching water move that calmed her and made her look at life from a new perspective. She stayed there for over an hour, simply being one with nature and enjoying the peacefulness that the ranch brought her. When she mounted Rebel again, she was ready for a more sedate pace, and the two of them rode back to the horse barn a great deal more leisurely. Cody stopped at Rusty's house, but when she wasn't there, he knew right where to go. She'd be where she always was. At the horse barn. He knew the woman better than she knew herself, and he could easily predict where she'd be. When he got to the horse barn, he stopped just inside, watching her with the animal she was working with. She was standing at the horse's head, looking straight into its eyes and speaking softly. He couldn't hear what she was saying, but the picture she presented almost dropped him to his knees. He'd loved this woman for so long, and he needed her in his life now even more than before. He could have stood and watched her forever, but he didn't want to startle her when she thought she was alone. Rusty, you can't avoid me forever, he said, finally breaking the silence and the magic of watching her work with the animal. Why not just talk to me and get it over with? Why, she asked, not even looking at him. Why would she never look at him anymore? What happened between us is never happening again. You're wasting your time following me around everywhere. He frowned at her. Why was she always so prickly around him? He hadn't done anything to her, or with her, she hadn't enjoyed and invited, but she seemed to see him as the enemy now. You are as stubborn as your red hair indicates. I don't know why you won't admit that what we have between us is good. Very good. Surely, she'd eventually listen to him, and they could move on with their relationship. He couldn't throw away his years of love for her, simply because she was being difficult. She didn't even look at him with her answer, but then again, she never did. Because there's nothing between us. Go home and leave me alone. She looked exhausted, and he wanted to reach out to her, but she didn't seem to want him around. Why did she never want him around? They'd been friends once. Good friends. Are you sure that's what you want? He asked. Because I don't think it really is. He couldn't keep being rejected this way. If he left, he wasn't coming back. I know that's what I want. You were a drunken mistake and a mistake that won't be repeated. He frowned at her, determined to get her to understand. Look, I know I was your first. You can't just walk away that easily. He wanted there to be a special bond between them. He could feel it. Why couldn't she? I can and I will. Don't worry. I had an itch, and I scratched it. I won't be coming after you anytime soon. Move on with your life. Cody felt as if she'd cut him to the quick. He wasn't going to constantly be rejected. If that's what you want. He turned and left the horse barn, going to his truck and sitting there for a moment, feeling totally dejected. Her words had been harsh, and maybe he deserved them for trying to push her into a relationship she didn't want, but he didn't need to be kicked in the head anymore. Unless she came to him, he was finished. No more. As he drove back to his ranch, his heart was heavy. But at least he wasn't going to keep going back to be kicked again. It was time for him to move on with his life. Asterisk. As she watched Cody leave, Rusty wondered what on earth she'd done. She felt things for Cody. Things that made her very uncomfortable. For a second, she considered chasing after him and apologizing, but she knew if she did, he would never stop coming around. And for now, she needed him gone. She'd been feeling sick for a while, and it was all she could do to take care of her home and her horses. She'd hoped the ride that day would make her feel completely better, but it seemed to have the opposite effect. No, she was feeling as bad as ever. She looked up at the sound of footsteps and saw Rhodey walking to her. I didn't hear you come in. I was already in. Rusty's eyes widened. So, you heard? Everything. I think you made a mistake there, Rusty. You hurt him, and he's not going to come back unless you apologize. Rusty frowned. I don't want to hurt him, but I also need him to give me some space. I wasn't sure how else to do that. She felt terrible for hurting Cody. He didn't deserve her rudeness. The way you chose wasn't very kind, Rhodey said, shaking his head. I didn't think you had it in you to treat someone that way. She sighed, deciding it was time for her to tell someone what had happened. Remember the night of Seth's wedding? Aaron and I went to the wedding together, and then he saw that hippie chick, and he was done for. I remember. We all knew you had a crush on him. You must have been devastated. You knew? Rusty was mortified at the very idea of everyone knowing about her feelings. Everyone but Aaron knew. I swear he must have been walking around with blinders on not to know. Rhodey shrugged. No one thought any less of you for it. Well, after he introduced me to that girl. Athena? Rusty nodded. Yeah, her. I left after I found out they were getting married the next day. I went to the watering hole, and I drank. Please tell me you drank pina coladas and other girly drinks. Straight whiskey. She shook her head. You know I don't even drink beer. I got smashed and fast. Cody took me home with him to make sure I didn't get into any kind of trouble while I was so drunk, and I came on to him. None of this is his fault. And now somehow, he thinks he needs to take care of me, because we were intimate. Rhodey shook his head. That man was not speaking out of obligation. You need to apologize. Let him know you're not ready for a relationship, but if you let this sit as it is, you're never going to see him again, and I don't think that would be good for either one of you. Rusty sighed. You're probably right. I'll figure it out. She looked at her friend for a moment, really not wanting to be home alone. "Come to my place and I'll cook you supper. We'll hang out and watch a movie or something." He nodded. "I can do that. But I don't know about eating your cooking. Are we talking about a packet of ramen to share?" She laughed, finished up with Rebel and linking her arm with his. "I'm a culinary genius, but don't you tell anyone. No one needs to know that I can cook, or I'd end up with hungry cowboys on my doorstep all the time. That's the last thing I want or need." Probably true. As they walked to her house, she cheered up a little, happy to have some companionship. She liked Rhodey. He was a good guy. Of course, she didn't like him the way she liked Cody. Cody? Did she actually have feelings for him? There was no way. No way at all. While Cody sat and waited, she put together a quick casserole and a salad. When he watched her make the salad, he frowned. "Did you just put blueberries in with spinach? You're going to love it. I promise." He looked skeptical, which just pleased her a little more. He was going to love her cooking, and she was going to love having someone to cook for just this once. By Monday morning, she'd be back to cowgirl mode and ready to take on the world, but just for that one night, she could be vulnerable with a friend. After supper, they played Scrabble, a game that Rusty had always loved, and when it was time for her friend to go, she already missed the companionship. Never had she been this starved for company. She sighed. She was going to town to church with her mother and grandmother the next day. She didn't go nearly as often as she should, and she could spend the whole day with the two women in this world she loved best. Since her father had left when she was 3, she and her mother had lived with her grandmother, and they'd been a good team. Rusty had even still lived there for a couple of years after starting at the ranch while she waited for a house to open up. Thanks to having that luxury, she had a good savings account. It felt good to be completely independent most of the time, but right then? She needed her mama and her grandma. By the end of the next day, she would remember why living with the two of them was not a good idea for her. And then all would be right with her world again. Well, as soon as she apologized to Cody. She wanted to give him a day or two to cool down first. It would be better for both of them. Chapter 3. True to her plans, Rusty spent all day on Sunday with her mother and grandmother. They went to church and then returned to her grandma's house to make a big Sunday lunch. Rusty had never quite understood the import her grandmother put on a huge Sunday lunch for her family, but it had always been there, and she was happy to comply. Side by side, the three women worked to create what her grandmother considered the perfect meal, and they sat down and ate it together. It was good for Rusty to just sit and spend some time with her family. It had been a couple of months since she'd spent an entire Sunday with them and not just met them for church services. After lunch, her grandmother took a nap. It was part of her Sunday tradition, and there was no way anyone was going to interfere with that. Rusty and her mother sat on the couch, having a much-needed mother-daughter chat. "How have you been?" her mother asked. There was no need for her mother to realize that she'd done something incredibly stupid that she'd regret for the rest of her life. "Oh, just the usual. Working with the horses and hanging out with the cowboys on the ranch. Sounds like fun to me. How's Aaron?" Rusty knew her mother had been aware of her crush on Aaron since high school. Rusty shrugged. "He got married a few weeks ago and doesn't work at the ranch anymore, but he seems happy enough." The wide-eyed look her mother gave her made Rusty laugh. "He married some girl the day after he met her. Was very strange." She shrugged. "I'm over it." "Are you?" "Definitely." Rusty changed the subject to some of the horses she was working with and how all of the Cauldron triplets had recently gotten married. Of course, her mother licked her fingers and raised them to the sky. It had been hard for Rusty to break herself out of the habit when she'd started working for the ranch. Everyone did it, and she was the odd woman out now, but she could understand how infuriating it must be for the Cauldrons. All 6 of them are married, her mother said. Why do I never know the gossip around here? Because you work hard to avoid gossip, and it's one of my very favorite things about you. Rusty was glad she'd decided to spend the day. It was good to just have some one-on-one time with her mother. What about you? Her mother shrugged. My job is the same as it's been for 20 years. Her mother was an insurance agent there in town. I keep myself busy with work and Mom. How's Grandma doing? She seems as spry as ever. Oh, she is. Her arthritis is bothering her some, but she's happy. No men on the horizon for either of you? Rusty wished both of them would find someone to be happy, but they seemed content with the lives they led. Absolutely not. I messed up my only marriage, and your grandmother, well, she'll never love again after losing Dad. I have often wished she'd start dating again, but she's never had any desire to do so. I guess the 2 of us will grow old together. Rusty smiled at that. Well, you couldn't have picked better people to spend your lives with. I might be joining you one of these days. You're not giving up on love because Aaron is married, are you? Her mother gave her a worried look. Not at all. I just think I need to be happy to be alone for a while. I have a good life. Rusty realized her words were true. She didn't need a man around, and life really did make her happy. Her mother looked skeptical, but she finally nodded. You do have a good life. Speaking of which, I have a novel calling my name. I should head home and do the few chores I haven't read for a while. Work starts early. Rusty felt refreshed after her ride the day before and spending her day with her mother and grandmother. The weekend had been just what she needed. It does. You look a little pale to me, though. Are you feeling okay? Her mother looked concerned. Rusty shrugged. I have a stomach bug. I'm actually going to see the doctor in the morning, and hopefully I'll feel better in a couple of days. I hope it's not catching, her mother said, reaching to an end table and putting a medical mask on. Mom, if I thought it was catching, I wouldn't be here. Why do you have that thing just laying around anyway? Rusty was surprised at all the masks that seemed to pop up all around her. It was as if everyone knew something she didn't, and she didn't like it. The things looked terribly uncomfortable. Someone was selling them, and I bought a couple. You never can be too careful. Especially not in a town where people are always licking their fingers, Rusty agreed. She hugged her mother. Tell Grandma bye when she wakes up from her nap. I will. Be careful. I'm always careful. On the drive home, Rusty couldn't help but wonder what the prevalence of masks was. If there was a pandemic, she certainly hadn't heard about it, and no one seemed to be talking about it. When she got home, her little house seemed so empty. She took a long hot bath and shaved her legs, though she wasn't sure why. It had always just been a rule of her grandmother's that she went to the doctor with freshly shaved legs, and it was one she obeyed, if for no other reason than it was important to her grandmother. It was only 8 when she went to sleep, but she was exhausted, and she knew seeing the doctor the next day would make for a long day. She hated when her routine was different. Asterisk. Rusty was at the doctor's office mid-morning the following day and waited impatiently in the exam room for her doctor. Dr. Jones had been her primary care physician since she was a little girl, and she genuinely liked the middle-aged woman. How's my favorite patient? Dr. Jones asked as she rushed into the examination room, using hand sanitizer as she did. I'm mostly okay. Just really tired. And I keep throwing up, and it's making me crazy. I'm only queasy for about half the day, and then I feel fine again. I think I must have a bug or something. The doctor frowned. It could be a bug. She looked at the chart and the notes her medical assistant had made before she walked in. Your cycle is late. Have you been sexually active? The question was asked so calmly, but it still caught Rusty off guard, and she blushed. Well, one time only, but yes. She hated to have to admit it. How long ago? Rusty counted. About 6 weeks, I guess? We're going to start with a pregnancy test and rule that out first. I couldn't be pregnant. Rusty shook her head. The idea had never even occurred to her that she'd get pregnant after just one time. No, that couldn't be it. She wasn't ready to be a mother. Why not? The doctor asked. No birth control is foolproof. They hadn't used birth control. Rusty couldn't figure out why she hadn't put 2 and 2 together before. I hope you're wrong, was all she could say. I'll send my medical assistant in with instructions on how to take the test, and then we'll go from there. The doctor left the room, and Rusty touched her stomach, wondering if she wanted to be pregnant or not. 15 minutes later, the doctor came back into the room. I'm going to prescribe some prenatal vitamins. You can ride for another 4 weeks or so, but after that, I want you to be more careful. You'd have a greater risk of losing the baby if you kept riding. Rusty stared at the doctor in shock. So, I'm pregnant? I'd put you at about 8 weeks. But, I had sex 6 weeks ago. I can point to the date on my calendar. Holy moly. What was she going to do with a tiny little human? We start counting days from the first day of your last cycle. How long is the nausea going to last? Can you give me anything for it? The doctor shook her head. From what you're describing to me, you're having normal morning sickness. You don't need meds for it. It should go away in about 4 weeks when you reach your second trimester. If it gets worse, or if it continues, we'll talk about medicine, but I really don't like to prescribe anything other than prenatal vitamins, and in some instances, progesterone in the first trimester. Rusty sighed. I have to deal with this for another 4 weeks. She wanted to cry at the very idea of feeling sick for that long. You'll survive. The good news is the worse the morning sickness, the greater the chance you'll carry full term. The doctor gave her other instructions, and Rusty tried to take good mental notes. As she left the office, she dropped off the prescription at the only drugstore in town and went to Subway to grab a sandwich. While she ate, her mind raced over what to do. She knew she would keep the baby. That was never a question, but she wondered about telling Cody. With as rude as she'd been to him, she didn't have the right to ask him to help out with the baby in any way. Besides, if the rumors about him were true, he was trying to dig himself out from under a huge mountain of debt. She couldn't add to that. She wasn't even half through with her meal when she realized she had to tell Cody, and she needed to tell him immediately. The man had a right to know that he was about to be a father, and she needed to apologize anyway. Rusty would have given anything not to have the conversation with him, but to her, that only meant doing it right away. She couldn't think about it first. And this was a conversation that needed to be held in person. As soon as she'd thrown her trash away and waved to the woman who was making sandwiches, wearing one of those masks, she made the short walk to the dealership. It didn't make sense for her to drive, and she wanted the exercise anyway. She was just glad she was off work for the day so she could take care of business like this. When she walked into the showroom, she saw Cody sitting at a desk, talking on a phone. Rather than wait for him to get off the phone, she walked to his desk and sat down across from him. She noted the surprised and skeptical look on his face, but she waited while he finished up his phone call. "What can I do for you, Rusty?" Cody's words were formal, and he looked like he expected the worst from her. "I came here to apologize," she said immediately. "I was really harsh with you, and you absolutely didn't deserve it." The words were hard to get out, but they were necessary. She really had been rude. He stared at her for a moment before he finally nodded. "Thank you. I am very sorry for the way I've acted. This situation of ours, Well, as you know, it's a new one for me, and I had no idea what to do about it. I can understand that. That's why I keep trying to talk to you about what happened. I really do think you did the right thing trying to push me to talk, no matter how rude I was, or how much I didn't want to. She shook her head. Thank you for not being angry with me. Cody smiled briefly. Have I ever been able to stay mad at you? Rusty just shook her head. And there's another reason I came too. This conversation was a million times harder than she'd realized it would be. He wasn't nearly as warm as he had been, and she wanted to cringe away from him and run from the room. Neither was an option. I'm pregnant. I know you weren't expecting this, and neither was I. I don't expect anything from you, but I do want you to know. You don't need to run into me at the grocery store when I'm 8 months pregnant and freak out that I never told you. With that, she got to her feet to leave. Cody reached out and caught her wrist. Sit down. For once in her life, Rusty listened to him. I'm sitting. What could he say to change the situation though? She was carrying a child. His child. You can't just tell me you're pregnant and leave. He shook his head. We're getting married. Today. I'm not marrying you today. We barely know each other anymore. We were friends in junior high, but that doesn't mean we're compatible to be husband and wife. She had no need to make another mistake with him. The first had been brutal enough. He leaned forward. I happen to know we were raised in the same church. Neither of us believe that sex before marriage is right. And now you're carrying my child. He couldn't believe just how much he liked calling the baby his child. He hadn't known it existed 5 minutes before, and now he was overjoyed at its existence. Marry me. If they were married, perhaps he could convince her that she belonged with him. He would certainly try. She sighed. I don't know, Cody. But deep down, a voice inside her told her it was the right thing. He wanted to marry her, and it felt right. Very right. When would you really want to marry? This weekend? That gives us 5 days to plan a wedding. I don't care if it's just the two of us there with the pastor, but I want it to be soon. I don't want people counting down the days and assuming we were forced to marry. We weren't forced. We're making a choice. Saturday then, I guess. She rubbed the back of her neck, wondering how she was going to tell her grandmother. Her mother would understand, no questions asked. Her grandmother? Not so much. I'll come by tonight, and we'll talk. I'll fix something for supper, though I have no idea what. Rusty did a mental inventory of her fridge, realizing there was chicken she needed to use. You don't have to cook for me. No, but I want to. Rusty was surprised by how much she wanted to do things for him. I know. Come hungry anyway. I think I'll make a chicken pot pie. It was one of those recipes her grandmother had given her, but she'd tweaked it just a tad, until she liked it much better. Oh, I can cook those. You poke the tops and throw them in the oven. Cody nodded. She laughed. No, I'll make mine from scratch. She had to wonder if the man had ever eaten anything that hadn't come from a can or the frozen section of the grocery store. I'll look forward to that. Do you know how long it's been since someone wanted to cook for me? Cody shook his head. He'd never dated much, and his father's illness had stopped what little he had done. And then the rumors had started about how dead broke his father had left him. Unfortunately, the rumors were true. He had no real money to take a girl out. His words gave her a picture of the loneliness he was feeling. After his father's death, he'd been alone on the family ranch, struggling to keep it going. She looked forward to making sure he was never lonely again. What time do you get off work? She asked. 5, unless I'm in the middle of a sale. And then it could be as late as 6. I'll text you if I'm running late, though. Do you even have my phone number? No, but you're about to give it to me. A man should have his fiancée's phone number. She rattled off her number, and he tapped it into his phone, sending her a quick text so she'd have his number as well. Hello, gorgeous. She looked at the text and rolled her eyes. I'll see you in a few hours. She had an extra skip to her step on the way out. She knew he was only marrying her because of the baby, but neither of them would be alone anymore. Ever. There had to be worse things to build a marriage on than mutual loneliness. The first thing she did when she got home was collapse on the couch, say a silent prayer, and call her grandmother. This was going to be a hard phone call, and she preferred to rip the Band-Aid off as fast as she could. Her grandmother didn't approve of sex before marriage, and Rusty knew her grandmother would have something to say about her being pregnant. Hello? Her grandmother had refused to join the 21st century with a cell phone, and instead, she still used a home phone. Thankfully, her mother had talked her into replacing her old rotary phone a few years back. Hi, Grandma. You don't call me often enough. It was how her grandmother started every phone call with her. It felt familiar and good. Rusty grinned. I call you twice a week, and I spent yesterday with you. You can't guilt me today. Humph. I'm getting married on Saturday, Grandma, and I want you to be there. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Are you pregnant? Rusty closed her eyes. It would be so much easier if she could lie to her grandmother, but she couldn't. Yes. Another pause, this time longer. Who's the boy? Cody Walters. You remember him, Grandma. I do remember him. I also remember teaching you to keep your legs crossed. I know, Grandma. Rusty waited for the lecture she knew was coming, but her grandmother surprised her. I'll be at your wedding. I like the idea of having my first great-grandchild in my arms. Rusty felt a wave of relief wash over her. That had been much easier than expected. I love you. I love you too. I'll see you at your wedding. You call your mother and invite her yourself. With that, she heard her grandmother hang up the phone. Rusty sighed. She was glad that call was over. She'd just wait until her mother was off work, and then she'd call her too. Never one to procrastinate, Rusty started going through her things. She'd fetched some cardboard boxes from the grocery store in town, and she packed as much as she thought she could, setting a timer for 4, so she could start supper. While she packed, she called Griselda, the Cauldron family's housekeeper. Hi, Grizzy. It's Rusty. You know I don't like being called Grizzy, the older woman said. I know. Hey, I'm getting married this weekend. I was hoping you would make cupcakes. Rusty knew the woman would do it. Asking was simply a formality. Of course, I will. And this time, I want the one with the red frosting. Rusty knew it was a long shot, but it was what she wanted, so why not ask for it? Oh, no. That cupcake will not be for you. Rusty sighed. Who's going to get it? She was sure she could make a deal to trade for the cupcake with the red frosting if she knew in advance who was getting it. She'd ask for the trade as her wedding gift. I'm not telling you that. I'll see you at the wedding. The call ended, and Rusty frowned. She really wanted that cupcake. Why did she never get to have a red one? While she fixed supper, Rusty called her mother. Hey, Mom. You're talking to me 2 days in a row? What have I done to deserve this? Her mother asked. Very funny. I'm getting married on Saturday. To Cody Walters. I want you to be there. I will be there. How far along are you? Rusty groaned. I guess we're obvious, huh? About 8 weeks. I can't wait to hold my grandbaby in my arms. Do you want to go shopping for a dress in Helena tomorrow night? As much as her mother loved it, Rusty hated shopping, but she needed a pretty dress to get married in. No one would appreciate it if she wore jeans and a work shirt. Yeah. I need to talk to my boss, but I'll take off a couple of hours early. If Jim didn't like it, she'd make up the hours later in the week. But she'd never really taken any vacation time, so she had a whole lot coming to her. I'll do the same. I'm the boss, and I can leave early every now and again. Sounds good. I'll meet you at your office around 3. Does that work? That works beautifully. I think you and Cody will be happy. I hope so. Rusty ended the call and glanced to see if she had a text from Cody. It was 5 after, and there was nothing, so she put the pot pie in the oven to bake. It wouldn't be done when he got there, but it wouldn't be too long after. Then she went into her bedroom and continued packing up everything she wouldn't need that week. She wanted to have as much done as she could so the transition to living with him would be smooth. They hadn't talked yet about where they would live, but it was a given. He had a big house, and she had a tiny little place meant for 1 or 2. Soon, they were going to be 3. It had to be his place. She'd just finished packing almost her entire bedroom when she heard a knock on the door, and she hurried over. She expected to see Cody standing there, but instead, it was Rhodey. She was surprised at how let down she felt. Hey you. Come in. I'm packing, but you can watch and talk. Why are you packing? He asked, frowning. Well, Cody and I are getting married on Saturday. So, I'm moving to his house. You apologized? Rhodey seemed excited that she'd made things right. I did. And we're going to have a lot to work through, but we'll do it for the baby. Rhodey hugged her. That's awesome. He took a deep breath. Something smells good. You're not invited. Rusty said. Cody's on his way, and I cooked supper for him. Save me a little for my lunch tomorrow. She laughed. I told you, no one can know I cook. Sometimes I wonder why we're even friends. Rhodey said on his way to the door. Cody was just arriving as he left, and he stopped and talked to the other man, aware that Rusty was listening from the doorway. Congrats on your bride, you're getting an amazing wife. Cody smiled, shaking his hand. I think so too. Rhodey took off across the ranch, and Rusty waited until Cody was in before shutting the door. Chapter 4. I've been working in my bedroom packing things, Rusty said, leading the way back. Cody decided not to mention the fact that she'd had another man in her house on the very day they got engaged. Why would he? The man was obviously just a friend of hers, and happy they were marrying. You need help? He asked. He didn't like the idea of her doing all that packing while she was pregnant. She shrugged. Not really. I've been working on it all day, and my room is almost done. I'm leaving the things that I'll use this week, but everything else is getting packed up. He sat down on the edge of her bed, thinking about how many times he'd dreamed of doing just that during the years he'd known her. Of course, in his fantasies, she'd been on the bed with him. You've gotten a lot done, he said, looking around him. Well, if we're marrying on Saturday, I don't have a ton of time. I've never been one to procrastinate either. I'd rather get it done and over with. She knew the packing would be the biggest task she had before the wedding, and it needed to be done so she could start fresh with their marriage. Smart. He watched her as she took some things off a shelf and carefully put them in a box. Dinner smells good. It won't be done for another 30 minutes. I hope that's all right. Sure. I mainly came over to talk anyway, not to have you feed me. You always want to talk. Well, I'm thinking about things changing a lot in a few days. Are you planning to keep working up until the baby's born? He asked. He wasn't sure how he felt about her working with the horses while she was expecting. She nodded. Doctor said I can only ride for 4 more weeks without it endangering the baby. After that, I'll need to keep my feet on the ground. From what little research I've done on it, a lot of doctors don't even want you on a horse in your first trimester, so I may ask Jim to take me off riding entirely starting tomorrow. I chatted with him on the phone earlier, and I'm taking a couple of days off next week so we can spend some time just getting to know each other all over again. How did he feel about reduced duty? Cody didn't want her to get any flack from her boss about it. He seemed good with it. He told me I was welcome to start the reduced duty tomorrow if it gave me peace of mind about the baby. Are you feeling all right? He asked. He'd noticed she'd lost a little weight, and she seemed even paler than usual, and she'd always been very light-skinned. She shrugged. Lots of morning sickness and fatigue, but I'll get through it. The morning sickness should only last another 4 weeks until I start the second trimester. I think I am going to tell Jim I want to keep my feet on the ground right away. I worry about losing the baby. For something she hadn't known existed 12 hours before, she was extremely concerned about the baby and its well-being. Is that going to cause problems? He asked. Nah. There are plenty of people who can ride them. I spend more time just calming the horses and doing basic training anyway. It shouldn't be a big deal. She hid a yawn behind her hand. I probably should have napped today, but I wanted to get started on the packing. Don't wear yourself out, Cody said. I don't want you hurting my baby. Rusty nodded. This was all about the baby after all. I'll do my best. He caught her hand and pulled her toward him. We haven't even sealed our engagement with a kiss, he said softly. She frowned. But this marriage is just for the baby. It's not about kissing and stuff. Not that she minded kissing him. She rather enjoyed it, but it did seem to lead to other activities. He narrowed his eyes. You don't think we're going to kiss? She shrugged. I figured you'd give me one of your spare rooms, and I'd live there, while you stayed in your room. They were only marrying for the baby after all. That's not how this is going to work. I want to be married to you, Rusty. I want to take you to my bed every night and make love with you. Cody was surprised she hadn't realized that's what he was after when he'd proposed. Yes, he wanted a baby, but more than anything, he wanted Rusty in his arms for the rest of his life. I'm not sure I'm ready for that. Not ready for that? Then exactly how are you pregnant with my child again? He asked. She wasn't making any sense to him at all. That was a drunken, she trailed off at the look on his face. So, I'm still chalked up to a drunken mistake? He shook his head. My child will never be referred to that way again. She nodded. I didn't mean it that way. Yes, you did. And I'm all for spending time with you and getting to know you better, but you have to quit saying that night was a mistake. It was the single most wonderful experience of my life, and I refuse to hear you refer to it that way. I'm sorry. She rubbed the back of her neck. I'm still not sure I'm ready to sleep with you yet. Can you give me some time? How much time? He wasn't willing to agree to her living in a room other than his indefinitely. She shrugged. I'm not sure. I guess I just want to get to know you all over again. We haven't spent a lot of time together since junior high, and I don't feel like I really know you. Although every time I look at you, I see you naked in my mind. Then we'll have to get to know each other fast. We can spend every evening together this week. She shook her head. My mom and I are going to Helena tomorrow to find me a wedding dress. I like your mom. He sighed. All right. We won't spend tomorrow night together. But I still want you in my bed. The look on her face told him all he didn't want to know. Stop comparing me to him. Rusty frowned, not entirely understanding what he was saying. Him? What are you talking about? I know you're comparing me to Aaron, and we're not going to get very far unless you learn not to do that. I won't have it. Aaron may have been the perfect man in her eyes, but he'd chosen a stranger to marry over her. Shouldn't that tell her something? I wasn't comparing you to anyone, she protested. I was just unsure how ready I'm going to be to share your bed in 5 days. He sighed. Okay, if you want a few extra days, that's fine, but I reserve the right to kiss you whenever I want to. Rusty frowned. She really wasn't sure she could let him kiss her and not want to start stripping to go to bed with him. You mean after we're married? I mean starting right now. He pulled her onto his lap. Like right this second. He lowered his head to hers, reminding her how much passion they had between them. He stroked the side of her neck, and she whimpered against his lips. She turned to him more fully, her lips parting for his as she wrapped her arms around his neck. Kissing Cody was like losing herself in lust. She knew it wasn't a good idea if she wanted to keep her resolve, but she wasn't sure she was going to convince him it was a bad idea. And then she stopped thinking entirely and simply lost herself in the kiss. Her hands were working on the buttons of his shirt when he pulled back. Something's beeping. Beeping, she was confused as she looked at him, her lips plump and wet from the kisses they'd shared. Supper. He grinned as she figured out where she was and jumped up to get their food out of the oven. She really had forgotten everything as they kissed, and he thought that was a good sign. Something had to be. He adjusted himself a little where his jeans had become too tight and followed her out into the kitchen. The casserole dish she removed from the oven looked nothing like the chicken pot pies he'd eaten. That's a pot pie? She nodded. Yes, and it's delicious. Trust me. She served them each a plate and carried them to the table and then got glasses of water. It felt strange to be doing something as normal as putting supper on the table right after she'd all but begged him to make love with her. He poked at his food with a fork for a second. This looks and smells delicious. She smiled. Try a bite. I promise, you're going to love it. He took a bite and smiled. This is nothing like the pot pies my dad used to make. She sat down at the table with him and smiled. I sure hope not from the way you described them. She took a sip of water. I never heard what happened to your mother. Breast cancer, he said softly. She got it while she was pregnant with me, but the doctors were determined it was just milk, so they never even checked. By the time I was born, she was too far gone. She died shortly after my first birthday. You have no memories of her at all? She asked. He shook his head. No. My dad had pictures of her, but that's it. There are a few of her holding me, but for my first year of life, she was going through chemo. I'm sorry. She reached out and covered his hand with hers. What about your dad? Oh, he and my mom married too young, and he took off when I was 3. He wasn't much of a family man, Mom said. Do you have memories of him? She shook her head. He never came back around. Never wanted anything to do with me, and that's just fine. She realized then she didn't want her child to feel rejected as she had. She wanted Cody to be a big part of the baby's life, even if things didn't work out between them. I can't imagine growing up without my dad. He was my rock. I can say the same thing for my mom. He frowned. We were both raised by single parents. I'm glad we're not doing that to our child. As much as I loved my dad and all he did for me, I always felt like something was missing. Me too, honestly. She took a bite of her pot pie. We'll make it work. We need to. He left shortly after that, but Rusty couldn't stop thinking about what it would be like for them to live together. And she wasn't as opposed to sex with him as she'd thought she was. That kiss had blown her mind. Asterisk. What about this one? Rusty asked her mother in her 4th wedding dress. I never thought a redhead could wear pink, But that shade is perfect for you, her mother said. I think that's the dress. The dress was an extremely pale pink that came down just past her knees. Do you think it's good for a wedding though? You're not going to find a traditional wedding dress in 4 days. That one looks really good, and I think you'll be happy in it. Besides, I don't think you want a traditional dress. Rusty sighed. I don't think I do either. I want it, but I don't. I think I'm going to be happy with this one. We need to get you shoes too, her mother made a face as she looked at Rusty's feet. I'm guessing you won't wear heels. Not to save the world from a race of hungry aliens who are only interested in our brains as food. Well, that makes a lovely mental picture. We'll go find you some shoes after this. No, after this we're going to eat. I'm starving. I'm eating for 2, and I threw up 4 times this morning. The baby is going to be born emaciated at this point. I really don't think you need to worry about that, her mother said, but yeah, let's eat. How would you feel about that little Italian place down the street? The one where we went every year when we went school shopping? I'd love that. They paid for the dress and left, heading straight for the restaurant. As soon as they were seated, by yet another server wearing a mask, her mother asked about names. Have you thought of names for the baby yet? First things first. I get married and then we talk about names for the baby. How did you and Cody start dating? I always thought he would be a perfect partner for you. Rusty was thrilled she was saved from having to answer by the server coming back for their orders. Her mother eyed her curiously, but she waited until the server was gone. Spill your guts, Angelica Rose. I still can't believe you gave me that awful name. Rusty definitely didn't feel like an Angelica Rose. And I can't believe you don't love it as much as I do. Rusty rolled her eyes, taking a sip of water, and hoping her mother would forget the discussion. What happened? Rusty sighed. You won't think less of me? She knew she couldn't tell her grandmother this part of the story, but her mother, well, her mother had always understood. I'm your biggest supporter and fan. No, I will not think less of you. Her mother watched her, the look on her face very motherly and curious. I was really upset when I found out Aaron was marrying his little hippie girl, and I went to the watering hole. Her mother shook her head. You didn't. You can't even handle a beer. You do not belong in a bar. Yeah, and I did shot after shot of whiskey. Cody saw me, and he came over to save me from myself, telling the bartender I'd had enough and taking me home with him, planning to put me on his couch to sleep. But one thing led to another, and here I am, pregnant with your first grandchild. Rusty shook her head, embarrassed to admit to all that had happened, but obviously her mother knew she'd had sex since she was pregnant. Oh, Rusty. That's not the best way to start a marriage for sure. Rusty nodded. I know. I pretty much avoided him since it happened, but he kept showing up wanting to talk about it. When I found out I was pregnant, I told him right away. He had a right to know. Yes, he did. Whose idea was it to get married? His. I told him as far as I was concerned, he had no responsibility toward the baby. I can handle it all financially with no problem. I have a ton of money stocked away for a rainy day. Just like you taught me. I taught you to save 10% of every paycheck. I have a feeling you save a little more than that. I live cheaply. It's more like a third I can put away every time. It helps that the ranch lets me rent out my little house so cheaply. Rusty took a breadstick and broke it in half. It's truly not a financial thing, but he's convinced our child needs both parents, even though we each grew up with just one. I did too, her mother reminded her. But I think 2 parents is the way to go, if you can make it work, and I know you can. How do you know that? Rusty asked. I barely know him at this point. It will work, because every morning you will wake up and choose to love him. You can't just choose to love someone, Rusty said. The very idea was ridiculous to her. Why not? You can choose to obey someone. You can choose to have a positive attitude. You can choose to wake up every single morning and show him all the love you have inside you. I'm not sure that works. It will. Try. Think of things you can do to make him happy. Think of things you can say that will make his day easier. Think of ways to show love. I'll try it. Rusty was still unconvinced, but she knew there was a whole lot of lust between them. Hopefully, love was possible as well. Who's standing up with you? Her mother asked. I never even thought about that. Time to think about it. Isn't there a girl who works on the ranch? Alcatraz or something? There is, but I don't really know her well. I'll ask Jana Callender. Rusty actually liked the idea of Jana being beside her as she married Cody. You two have always been close. Good choice. I'll see if Jana, Val, and Marcy will all come to the wedding. I'd really like all 12 of the sisters and even Bob, but someone has to run the kids' camp. So, you'll be happy to just have the oldest 3 sisters. All 3 were in your grade, weren't they? Yeah. We were all so close. I wish we saw more of each other. Rusty smiled. I went out there a few weeks back and did some trick writing for the kids. They loved it. Her mother frowned. You're not going to keep writing, are you? Rusty shook her head. Doctor says I'm safe for 4 more weeks, and then I have to stop. I talked to Jim this morning, and he's fine if I stop writing tomorrow. Most of the work I do is off horse anyway. Good. I know how much you love to ride, but that's my grandbaby in there, and I don't want it hurt. I don't either. Well, call Jana on the way back to Cauldron Valley. I want you to make sure she has time to come, and I would think she'll have to find someone to replace her. Probably. Yeah, I'll call her. I really can't imagine getting married without Jana at my side. We've been besties since kindergarten. While her mother drove back to Cauldron Valley, Rusty called Jana. When her friend answered, she said, I need a maid of honor for Saturday afternoon. You in? What? Who are you marrying? I didn't even know you were dating anyone. Do you remember Cody Walters? Rusty asked, knowing her friend had always been very impressed by Cody's looks. Oh, yeah. He was dreamy. Jana sighed. You're marrying Cody Walters on Saturday? I think that's amazing. I will be there. I was hoping you'd bring Val and Marcy too. I feel like we were always a foursome, and it would be weird to get married without any of you. Absolutely. All 3 of us will be there. What color dress should I wear? I don't care. I'm wearing a really pale pink, so something other than that. Rusty truly didn't care what her friend wore as long as she was there. I'm not a fan of pink anyway. I'll wear something. Well, I'm pleased to hear you don't plan on showing up naked. Never. Why would I do that? I'd look like a tramp. Jana's laughter filled Rusty with happiness. I was raised better than that. I know you were. Hey, Jana? Thanks for being my friend. Rusty knew they'd grown apart over the years, but she still considered her the best friend she'd ever had. I wouldn't have it any other way. See you Saturday. I'll be the one at the front of the church, shaking like a leaf. Marrying the sexiest guy in all of Cauldron Valley, you mean? That too. Rusty grinned as she ended the call. I have a maid of honor. Good. Now everything else can just fall into place. Her mother smiled. Chapter 5. Saturday afternoon came way too quickly as far as Rusty was concerned. She had gotten her entire house packed and ready to be moved, and had a suitcase waiting in the back of her truck. They'd figure out when to move everything else later. She'd barely seen Cody that week, because he'd been working extra hours so he could take a few days off the following week. She'd scheduled herself off Monday and Tuesday, but the ranch really couldn't spare her more than that. It felt good to be needed, even though she wanted the time with Cody. No, she needed the time with Cody. They had to find a way to get to know one another and get along well. It had been rocky between them for a little while. Rusty glanced in the mirror and saw her dark red hair cascading over her shoulders. There were a few flowers that had been placed strategically throughout. "Are you sure I should have flowers in my hair?" she asked. Jana was standing behind her. "I'm positive. You look absolutely gorgeous." Usually she wore her hair back in a ponytail so it would be out of the way, but she couldn't help but be impressed with the work Jana had done. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes meeting her friend's in the mirror. "You're very welcome. I wouldn't have missed this for anything." Jana had chosen a yellow dress to wear, and she looked amazing in it, as she did in everything. Val sat in a chair watching Rusty. "I'm so glad you insisted all three of us come. We had to get Minnie out there to take over the crafts, but Mom was at least willing to let us go. For you." Jana, Val, and Marcy had been her three closest friends growing up. The three sisters were all in her grade in school, and they'd just grown closer with every year. Jana was of mixed-race descent, Val was blonde, and Marcy was Asian. They made a striking trio, especially when they told everyone they were sisters. Marcy stood to one side, and she reached out and repined one lock of Rusty's hair. "There. Now you're perfect. I've always envied your beautiful red hair." Rusty wrinkled her nose. "I hate my hair." She got to her feet, taking a deep breath. "Am I ready for this?" She wanted to turn tail and run, but every time she thought about it, she remembered the baby. Her baby deserved to have its father in its life. Jana laughed. "For sleeping with Cody every day for the rest of your life?" "I would say yes." Blushing, Rusty laughed. "Stop. You know how ugly redheads are when they blush." "I know you always say redheads are ugly when they blush, but there's not an ugly thing about you, Rusty." Jana frowned. "We need someone to take a group pic. I guess we could do a selfie, but it wouldn't be the same." There was a knock at the back door, and Rusty laughed. "I think we found our photographer." The door opened just a smidge and Joy, Jim's wife, came into the room. "Jim told me to come and make sure everyone is ready." Rusty nodded. "All but one thing. I need a pic with my three besties." Joy grinned and nodded. "I would be honored." She raised the phone she was handed, and the four friends smiled and posed, with Rusty and Jana in the middle. "There you go. I took 3, just in case one of blurred or Rusty was picking her nose or something." Rusty made a face. "I only pick my nose when no one is looking." The others laughed. Joy handed the phone back to Jana, and she looked over the four friends. "You look amazing. All of you. See you in a minute. I'm going to let everyone know you're ready." Rusty looked at the three sisters, her oldest and dearest friends. "This is our last group hug as a group of single women. We'd better make the most of it." The four of them crowded together and hugged. Rusty blinked back a tear, not wanting to mess up the makeup Jana had painstakingly applied. "This mascara had better be waterproof." Jana laughed. "Of course, it is. I wouldn't put non-waterproof mascara on a woman on her wedding day." Minutes later, Rusty was standing at the front of the church with her hand in Cody's, and she realized this was it. There would never be another first kiss. Another first touch. She thought she should panic, but somehow it felt right. Cody felt right. When Pastor Dinkelheimler told Cody to kiss his bride, he gave her a look that she had a hard time reading. It seemed to be pure possessiveness, which was surprising, And then he pulled her to him and gave her a kiss that was so tender it made her want to drop to her knees and weep, right there and then. When he broke off the kiss, he rested his forehead against hers and looked deeply into her eyes, and she could hear gasps from the congregation, and see the flashes going off. She didn't care. This was a moment she would treasure for the rest of her life. At the reception, Cody kept his arm anchored around Rusty's waist, no matter who they were talking to or what they were doing. "You know you can't superglue me to you," she said softly. "I do know that." "Doesn't make me not want to," he whispered back. Rusty was a little surprised at just how much in love he was acting, but she knew it had to be a show. It was their wedding day after all, and every eye in the room was on them. People would know soon enough that they'd married for the sake of their unborn child, but they didn't have to know on their wedding day. When Griselda brought out the cupcake tower, there was one lone cupcake with red frosting off to the side of the others. "I'm getting that red cupcake," Rusty whispered to Cody, moving toward the table that held the treats. Cody laughed and moved with her. "What's the significance of the red cupcakes?" he asked. "I have no idea, but I never get one, and I want it. I told Griselda to make me one, and she said the red frosted one would not be for me. So, I'm taking it while she's not looking." Just as they reached the table, and her hand stretched out to grab it, Griselda snatched it from the table. "I already told you this is not for you." She shook her head at Rusty. "This is for someone else." "But it's my wedding day." "I'll give you a special one for the baby shower." Rusty was surprised that the woman knew, but she didn't ask any questions. How strange. No one knew yet. As Rusty and Cody watched, the cupcake with the red frosting was taken through the crowd and presented to Rhodey. Rhodey accepted it with a strange look. Rusty hurried toward her friend. "I'll trade you a white one for a red one." "You will not," Griselda said. "That's his cupcake." Rusty pouted as her friend popped half of it into his mouth in one bite. She understood though. No one wanted to make Griselda mad. Cody looked down at Rusty with a laugh. "It was his turn, I guess. Mine was really good." He still didn't know why he'd been given it, but he'd loved every bite. Rusty glared at him. "I want one." "You're going to live without a cupcake with red icing." "I promise." "Let's go feed each other cupcakes so everyone can watch." "Don't shove the cupcake in my face," she said. "I won't. You look too beautiful to have frosting mess you up." Rusty frowned. "You don't have to say I'm beautiful." "I know." He led her to the table with the cupcakes, and they delicately fed some to each other. Before long, the reception was winding down, and the two of them headed out to the parking lot. Rusty looked back and forth between the two trucks. "I guess I can follow you." "We're not leaving our wedding in separate vehicles," he said. "You're riding with me." As far as he was concerned, it was non-negotiable. She nodded. "Makes sense. My suitcase is in the back of mine. I'll grab it." Rusty climbed up into the cab of his truck and buckled her seatbelt while she waited for him. When he joined her, she asked, "What do you want me to fix for supper?" She didn't have anything planned, and she had no idea what he had in his house in the way of food. She had a feeling there would be a huge grocery trip in her future. "You're not cooking on our wedding night." "What kind of cad do you think I am?" "Cad? I like that word," she grinned at him. "Me too. Let's go to the new steak place in town." "I haven't been yet." He'd wanted to go, but he'd been unwilling to spend the money. She was worth spending money on, and for their wedding night, he felt like it was necessary. She frowned. "That place is expensive." "It's the least I can do for my new wife." Cody didn't like to think that she was worried about his finances. "I can pay," she offered, trying to be blasé about it. "I'll pay." "All right." She wasn't going to keep arguing with him about it. Besides, they were going to be sharing their income anyway. Tell me about working at the dealership. He shrugged, not wanting to discuss his financial problems, but she was his wife, and she had a right to know everything. When Dad was sick, he wasn't able to work as hard, but he didn't clue me in on the financial situation. I thought we were fine, and he was just taking the time he needed to take. I would have gotten another job to help out, but I had no idea. After he died, I found out he had taken out a couple of mortgages on the ranch. It's been in my family for 4 generations, and I'm not about to lose it, so I sold some of my herd, and I'm working 3 days a week at the dealership to make extra payments. It confirmed the rumors Rusty had heard around town, so she just nodded. I can help out. I've saved quite a bit over the years. That's your money. I'll save my family ranch. When our children want to inherit, won't it be our family ranch? She asked. It will. For now, I don't want you worrying about it. Rusty didn't say anything to that, but she knew she'd bring it back up later. She wasn't going to accept no for an answer. They pulled into the steak place, and the two of them got out. He took her hand as they entered the restaurant, and she smiled. It seemed strange to her, but he liked to touch her, whether in public or private. After they were seated, she smiled. I appreciate you taking me out for our wedding night. I would have cooked, but it's nice to have a break on occasion. Do you like to cook? He asked. She nodded emphatically. I always have. I know it doesn't seem to fit with my personality, but it's one of my very favorite things. That's awesome, because I'm kind of a wreck in the kitchen. Good, then we won't have to fight over who gets to cook. She loved the idea of cooking for him. The 2 times she'd done it already, he'd been very appreciative. You will never hear an argument from me about who gets to cook, he said, shaking his head. A server came to the table wearing a Wonder Woman mask, and Rusty had to wonder if they were the new fashion statement or something. They still confused her. Hi there, the server said, and it was her voice that made Rusty aware of who she was. Tiffany. They'd been in the same grade at school. Hi, Tiffany. What are you two doing together? Tiffany's eyes were wide. I know you guys were friends in school, but I see some hand-holding going on here. Cody smiled at the pretty blonde. We got married a few hours ago. There was no point not telling her the truth when it was about to be all over town. Wow. How did I miss that was happening? Rusty shrugged. No clue. You've always been good about keeping up with local news. Gossip. She was a gossip monger, and everyone knew it. I have. Interesting. Anyway, let me take your drink orders. After the girl walked off, Rusty looked at Cody. I was never very fond of her. Neither was I, but she's changed a lot since she and Adam got married. 3 kids in 3 years will do that to you. I guess it would. I don't want an only child, but let's not even think about 3 kids in 3 years, Rusty said. I'm not sure I could handle that. She loved the idea of having a baby, but the sleepless nights scared her a little. Yeah, that's a lot. He found what he wanted on his paper menu and pushed it to the side. How many days were you able to get off work this week? He'd still be doing his own ranch chores, but he wanted them to have time to spend together. Just Monday and Tuesday, but we'll make the most of them. She smiled at him brightly, determined to follow her mother's advice from that moment forward. She would choose to love Cody. She was sure she'd be annoyed with him at times, but choosing to love him would make all the difference in the world. For both of them.